Do you live in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Cuba, or anywhere across the Lesser Antilles? Do you have family in San Juan, Santo Domingo, Kingston, or the Virgin Islands? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this full video, because right now the Caribbean is dealing with 3 separate hazards at the same time, moving across the same stretch of ocean, over the same island chains, and most people watching the news tonight have no idea all 3 are happening at once. Let's start with what the National Hurricane Center is actually tracking above the water, because this is the piece most people check first. As of the most recent tropical weather discussions out of Miami, forecasters are watching an Eastern Caribbean tropical wave, positioned along roughly 66 to 67 degrees west, running from Puerto Rico southward, moving westward at 15 to 20 knots. At the same time, a separate wave is sitting further west, along 87 degrees west in the Western Caribbean, and 2 more waves are strung out across the open Atlantic, one near the Cape Verde Islands and one further west, near 45 degrees. That is 4 separate tropical waves stacked across the basin at once, which sounds alarming, but here's the problem: none of them are expected to develop. The National Hurricane Center's official outlook says tropical cyclone formation is not expected across the Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, or the Gulf during the next 7 days. So why, in the middle of what should be a ramping up hurricane season, is nothing developing? This next part matters, because it explains exactly why the tropics have gone quiet at the exact moment they are usually waking up. 2 things are working against these waves right now, and they are working together. The first is Saharan dust. Late June through mid-August is the peak of what meteorologists call the Saharan Air Layer, a mass of hot, dry, dust-filled air that lifts off the Sahara Desert and rides the trade winds 3,500 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, arriving in the Caribbean every 3 to 5 days in fresh waves. That dust does 2 things to a tropical system trying to form. It dries out the atmosphere around a developing storm, choking off the moisture a system needs to build convection, and it wraps the storm in a layer of warm, stable air that suppresses the thunderstorm activity at its core. Satellite imagery over the past several days has shown exactly this kind of dust blanketing large stretches of the Caribbean, and forecasters have pointed to it directly as one of the 2 main reasons nothing out there is getting organized. But here is the second ingredient, and it is arguably the more important one this year. The Atlantic and the Caribbean are currently under the influence of an El Niño pattern. And El Niño does something very specific and very hostile to tropical development in this basin. It strengthens upper-level winds blowing across the Caribbean from the Pacific side, and those winds create wind shear, a difference in wind speed and direction at different altitudes that literally tears a developing storm apart before it can organize. Forecasters have described this as development prohibiting Saharan dust combined with El Niño-generated hostile upper-level winds working in tandem across the tropical Atlantic and the Caribbean right now. Combine dry, dusty, stable air with strong shear ripping through the atmosphere above it, and you get exactly what we are seeing. Wave after wave, rolling off Africa and crossing the Caribbean without ever getting the chance to spin up. Let's look a little closer at exactly what these tropical waves look like on the map right now, because the details matter more than the vague word wave suggests. The Eastern Caribbean wave tracking along that 66 to 67 degree line is passing almost directly south of Puerto Rico, dragging scattered moderate convection with it between roughly 15 and 18 degrees north, the kind of disorganized shower and thunderstorm activity that, under different atmospheric conditions, is exactly the seed a tropical depression grows from. Further east, near the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa, another wave is producing scattered moderate to isolated strong convection over a wide stretch of open ocean, the classic starting point for what eventually becomes a long-track Atlantic hurricane later in the season. None of these waves are broken or weak on their own. They are producing real, organized rain and thunderstorm clusters. What they are missing is the surrounding atmospheric environment that would let that convection wrap up into something with a closed circulation. And that missing ingredient, again, comes back to the dust and the shear working against them in tandem. Most people are missing this next detail, and it is the one that should stop you from fully relaxing about the quiet week. Some forecast models are hinting that the hostility in the upper atmosphere could begin to ease around the middle of August, which is still more than a week away, and, by every forecaster's own admission, well beyond any reliable forecast horizon. That is meteorologist language for don't hang your hat on it yet, but it is also a signal worth remembering, because mid to late August is historically when the Atlantic hurricane season transitions from its slow build-up phase into its most dangerous stretch, the period when the main development region between Africa and the Caribbean starts producing the strongest, longest-tracked storms of the year. Right now, the atmosphere is holding the door shut. Nobody can tell you how long that door stays shut. Now the focus shifts to the second hazard moving across the region at this exact moment, the one hanging directly over people's heads, whether they are watching for hurricanes or not. That same Saharan air layer that is suppressing tropical development is also blanketing entire islands in dust thick enough to see, breathe, and worry about. Over the past several days, satellite imagery has shown a large plume of dust sitting directly over the Caribbean, dense enough that air quality monitors across the region have flagged unhealthy conditions in multiple locations at once. Further east, near the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa, another wave is producing scattered moderate to isolated strong convection over a wide stretch of open ocean, the classic starting point for what eventually becomes a long-track Atlantic hurricane later in the season. None of these waves are broken or weak on their own. They are producing real, organized rain and thunderstorm clusters. What they are missing is the surrounding atmospheric environment that would let that convection wrap up into something with a closed circulation. And that missing ingredient, again, comes back to the dust and the shear working against them in tandem. Most people are missing this next detail, and it is the one that should stop you from fully relaxing about the quiet week. Some forecast models are hinting that the hostility in the upper atmosphere could begin to ease around the middle of August, which is still more than a week away, and, by every forecaster's own admission, well beyond any reliable forecast horizon. That is meteorologist language for don't hang your hat on it yet, but it is also a signal worth remembering. Because mid to late August is historically when the Atlantic hurricane season transitions from its slow build-up phase into its most dangerous stretch, the period when the main development region between Africa and the Caribbean starts producing the strongest, longest-tracked storms of the year. Right now, the atmosphere is holding the door shut. Nobody can tell you how long that door stays shut. Now the focus shifts to the second hazard moving across the region at this exact moment, the one hanging directly over people's heads, whether they are watching for hurricanes or not. That same Saharan air layer that is suppressing tropical development is also blanketing entire islands in dust thick enough to see, breathe, and worry about. Over the past several days, satellite imagery has shown a large plume of dust sitting directly over the Caribbean, dense enough that air quality monitors across the region have flagged unhealthy conditions in multiple locations at once. But that is not the real story tonight, not entirely, because while everyone's eyes are pointed up at the sky, the ground underneath the Caribbean has been anything but quiet. This is where it becomes dangerous to think of the Caribbean as a single, simple hazard zone, because Puerto Rico and the surrounding islands sit directly on top of one of the most structurally complicated plate boundaries on the planet. The region lies at a highly oblique convergent boundary between the Caribbean plate and the North American plate, and GPS observations have identified a distinct Puerto Rico Virgin Islands, microplate caught in what seismologists have described as a complex rotational dance between the two larger plates, with the North American plate grinding past the Caribbean plate at roughly 20 millimeters a year. A research paper published earlier this year, analyzing more than 230 focal mechanism solutions from the long-running southwestern Puerto Rico earthquake sequence, mapped out an X-shaped pattern of intersecting fault families beneath the island, a structure that has apparently been active for several million years. In plain terms, Puerto Rico is not sitting on one fault. It is sitting on a tangled intersection of several fault families, all accommodating the same grinding plate motion at once. Here's why this is serious right now, rather than just an abstract geology lesson. Southwestern Puerto Rico, centered around the town of Guanica, has been living inside an active earthquake sequence that began in December of 2019, and, according to seismic records, has never fully stopped. That original sequence included 11 earthquakes of magnitude 5 or greater and culminated in a magnitude 6. 4 events that caused an estimated $3.1 billion in damage, killed 4 people, injured 9 others, and forced thousands of residents into tent cities because their homes were too damaged or too dangerous to re-enter. That was not a one-time disaster that resolved itself and vanished from the record. Small earthquakes tied to that same fault system are still being logged in the exact same area today, including a magnitude 2. 3 events centered right at Guanica and a magnitude 3. 1 quake recorded near Mayaguez in the final days of July. The sequence quieted, but it never fully ended, and the same fault network responsible for the 2019 to 2020 disaster is still capable of producing another significant event with very little additional warning. And now it gets worse when you consider how young this X-shaped fault structure discovery actually is. Scientists have only recently been able to map the full geometry of the conjugate fault system beneath southwestern Puerto Rico, using a combination of GPS ground deformation data and satellite radar interferometry, techniques precise enough to detect millimeter scale shifts in the Earth's surface over time. What that mapping revealed is that the region is not simply extending in one direction or compressing in another, the way a textbook fault line would suggest. It is doing both at once, pulled apart along one set of fractures, while being squeezed together along another, a pattern researchers say has been etched into the rock for several million years and is now actively reactivating in the modern earthquake sequence. That kind of structural complexity is part of why the Guanica area has proven so difficult to fully forecast. and why small earthquakes there keep appearing in the record years after the original 2019 sequence technically ended. And now it gets worse when you widen the view beyond just southwestern Puerto Rico, because the wider Caribbean plate boundary has been active across multiple islands this year, not just one. In February, a magnitude 5. One earthquake struck in the North Atlantic roughly 163 kilometers north of San Juan, strong enough to be felt across the northern coast of the island. In late June, a significant magnitude 5. 0 earthquake struck in the Caribbean Sea near La Romana in the Dominican Republic, rattling communities along the island's southeastern coast. And just 1 year earlier, in August of 2025, a magnitude 5. 7 earthquakes struck offshore southeast of Boca de Yuma, also in the Dominican Republic, part of the same broader boundary zone where the Caribbean plate presses against the North American plate, along what is known as the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest points in the entire Atlantic Ocean, and a structure capable of producing both major earthquakes and dangerous tsunamis. This next part matters more than almost anything else in this video because it is the historical comparison that regional emergency planners keep coming back to. On August 4th, 1946, precisely 80 years ago to the day as this video is being made, a magnitude 7. 8 earthquakes struck roughly 289 kilometers northwest of Ponce, Puerto Rico, at a depth of 15 kilometers underwater. It remains the strongest earthquake ever recorded near Puerto Rico since seismic monitoring began, and it triggered a Caribbean-wide tsunami that struck the Dominican Republic hardest, killing more than 1,800 people and leaving tens of thousands homeless along that coastline. That earthquake sits on the exact same tectonic boundary, generating today's smaller events, the same Puerto Rico trench system, the same grinding collision between the Caribbean plate and the North American plate that produced the magnitude 5. 0 near La Romana just weeks ago, and the magnitude 5. 7 near Boca de Yuma the year before. 80 years is not ancient history on a geological timescale. It is a single heartbeat, and it is a direct reminder that this stretch of ocean floor has already proven, on the exact anniversary we are sitting inside right now, that it is capable of producing an earthquake powerful enough to trigger a deadly regional tsunami. Most people are missing this next detail too. Averaged out over the past decade, the region within 300 kilometers of Puerto Rico has recorded roughly 72 earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater every single year, which works out to an earthquake, striking somewhere near the island, on average, once every 5 days. That is the baseline. That is simply how active this plate boundary is when nothing unusual is happening at all. Layer the ongoing Guanica sequence on top of that baseline, layer the recent Dominican Republic events on top of that, and you get a region that is, in an ordinary sense, constantly shaking, occasionally significantly, and sitting on a fault system that has already demonstrated, within living historical memory, that it can produce a tsunami-generating quake in the magnitude 7 range. Think about what all 3 of these hazards moving at once actually means for families living across this region tonight. In San Juan and across northern Puerto Rico, residents are breathing dust thick enough to trigger air quality advisories, while simultaneously living on an island where small earthquakes tied to an unresolved 2019 sequence are still being logged on a near-weekly basis. In Guanica and the surrounding towns in the island's southwest, many families are still living in homes repaired after the 2020 disaster, and every small aftershock this summer is a fresh reminder of how quickly a normal week can turn into another emergency. Across the Dominican Republic, coastal communities near La Romana and Boca de Yuma have felt the ground move twice in roughly a year from earthquakes, tied to the same offshore trench that produced the deadly 1946 tsunami. And across the wider basin, from Jamaica to the Windward Islands to the Bahamas, residents are watching a tropical outlook that looks deceptively calm, knowing that the same dust currently protecting them from development is scheduled, by the calendar if nothing else, to thin out as August wears on. Emergency planners across the region do not get the luxury of treating these 3 hazards as separate calendars. School districts in San Juan that run earthquake drills every semester because of the ongoing Guanica sequence are the same districts that have to track hurricane preparedness supplies every June, and the same schools whose nurses fields extra respiratory complaints during the thickest dust weeks of July and August. Coastal resorts across the Dominican Republic that market themselves on calm turquoise water during the current lull in tropical activity are built along the same shoreline that a magnitude 7 event on the Puerto Rico Trench could, in a worst-case scenario, send a tsunami toward the same trench that did exactly that in 1946. None of these agencies get to plan for one hazard at a time, because the geography does not separate them, and the calendar this time of year does not separate them either. Here is why none of these 3 threads should be treated as separate stories happening to separate people. They are all playing out across the same geography, often to the same families, in the same stretch of weeks. A household in coastal Puerto Rico is simultaneously monitoring a hurricane outlook that could change within days if the upper level winds relax, tracking air quality alerts tied to a dust plume that settles differently depending on where local showers happen to fall, and living with the low-grade, constant possibility of ground shaking tied to a fault system that has never gone fully silent since 2019. Emergency management agencies across the region have to plan for all three simultaneously, because a serious earthquake does not wait for hurricane season to end. And a tropical system, when the atmosphere finally allows one to form, will not wait for dust season to fully clear first either. One more thing you need to know before this video ends, and it is the detail that ties the calm sky back to the restless ground beneath it. Forecasters keep repeating the same phrase about the current lull in tropical activity, that it is nothing to hang your hat on, because Saharan dust and El Niño-driven wind shear are powerful but temporary breaks, not permanent shields. Every year, at some point between mid-August and October, those breaks ease enough for the main development region between Africa and the Caribbean to start producing serious storms again. Nobody watching the satellite loops tonight can tell you the exact day that shift happens this year. What forecasters can tell you is that the pattern historically breaks down right around the point the calendar reaches now, and that when it does, the same islands currently breathing Saharan dust and logging small earthquakes near Guanica and La Romana will also be the first ones watching the tropical outlook maps for something spinning up out of that same wave train currently dying quietly over open water. The next several weeks are going to tell us a lot about how this Caribbean hurricane season actually unfolds, whether the current combination of dust and shear holds the door shut all the way into September, or whether the mid-August window some models are hinting at turns out to be real. Seismic networks across Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic are still logging new events along the same fault system that produced the 1946 tsunami on the very week that anniversary falls. Dust monitors across the region are still tracking fresh plumes rolling in every few days from across the Atlantic. And satellite loops over the main development region are still showing wave after wave lifting off the African coast, waiting for the moment the atmosphere finally lets one of them breathe. Right now, tonight, across this entire stretch of ocean, three separate natural systems are moving at once, quietly, mostly out of view of anyone not watching closely. And the only honest thing anyone can tell you is that all three are still actively evolving as this video goes up. And the Caribbean, as it does every single year around this time, is about to find out which one moves first.